It's time yet again to dive into Civ 7 and ask the question, is this game any better? Firaxis had a rough time post-launch, which I'm sure you're probably aware of. What you might not know is that the game has finally started to see negative reviews peter off, likely a result of the many patches that have improved map generation, smoothed out UI, and covered enough bugs to make Todd Howard blush. But is Civ 7 actually worth playing again? I've been playing the game for far longer than I'd care to admit, and while Antiquity is very strong, a lot of the momentum peters off by the time you make it to the next era. In part, a lot of this was due to how the exploration age was designed. For economic victories, you need to acquire treasure resources which are only located on faraway continents. Since these continents have to be locked behind ocean tiles, which you can't explore until the Second Age, this constrained a lot of the early map generation. For example, a lot of the maps would be filled with a very obvious set of buffer islands, before allowing you to proceed to new lands. The first set of changes that tackled map generation came with 1.2.0, but that mainly smoothed out the jagged coast that plagued certain map types for far too long. Over time, more minor changes have been made, but 1.2.5 is the first update that has radically overhauled how new maps are generated. And 1.2.5 is the focus for today's video. In fact, the developers set aside an entire dev diary talking about the improvements made to how maps are created. I won't bore you with the nitty-gritty, but there are a few things to remember. Firstly, the game added 2 new map types. You can pick from Pangea and Islands or Continents and Islands. We've had a similar map before, but these additions fix a lot of the aforementioned issues like jagged continents and the weird island belts. They also make use of the new Voronoi map generation. In short, Voronoi sprays points onto a map and then draws lines around them to create cells. These cells help determine things like continents, where additional features such as resource placement and natural wonders are added onto later. From my limited time playing with the new update, I enjoyed the Pangea and Islands map the most. I was already a Pangea player, but this feels much closer to the maps that we were getting in earlier installments of the franchise. It makes the jump to the exploration age much smoother, because the islands that I was exploring looked like actual land masses that you could find in the real world. They were no longer cookie-cutter pieces with bizarre dimensions thanks to map restrictions. For players that love the older map generation for whatever reason, those maps are still available to you. Only the 2 new maps use the Voronoi generation, but the developers have promised further support in the future. I'm just glad to have substantial coves, bays, and other interesting water features that were not possible with the older maps. As a professional complainer, I can't give Firaxis a complete pass here. We still don't have an Earth map, which is supremely ironic considering it was the basis for the Exploration Age's design. The map pool is still underwhelming as well. While it may seem like there is a lot of variety, most of the maps boil down to how many continents you want, with little variation in between. The other half of this update has to do with the UI. At this point, I've said the term so many times that I'm beginning to forget what it means. At launch, it just meant a simple placeholder for text with very little artistic design behind it. There are some pretty saucy rumors as to why it launched the way it did, but I'll let you follow the ayahuasca-scented trail down the rabbit hole.
Get my lawyer!
Anyway, this is the umpteenth update that is focused on UI and map design, so it only makes sense that we would have another go at it. In my last video, I said that I was okay with the UI as it was, and I will still stand by that comment. Did it impress anyone? No. But it was like my video editing. Bland, but gets the job done. 1.2.5 has completely reworked the building placement UI. You can see it for yourself here on the screen. Now you can view the slots that each building occupies, and the game clearly lays out the optimal spot to place down improvements. Yield changes are also laid out in the same menu. This is one of those tweaks that doesn't seem big until you're interacting with it in-game. There were so many times when I would overbuild on a certain tile and not realize how much I was missing out on. Newer players will especially appreciate the indentation and spacing for tooltips. When I first got the game, I remember how much of a chore it was reading through each of the text boxes. Some of the other changes that I didn't see documented were art additions to areas like the celebration screen, which now shows fireworks. Another example is the escape menu, which provides much more information on your current game. The next step should be to clean up the game creation screen, but I'm happy with what I've seen so far. The omission of map tags still feels grating, and that's another direction I could see the dev team taking in a future update. It's a shame to compare this game next to Civ 6's colorful and informative map tags and have nothing to show. In a game all about stacking yields and making smart building placements, this is a weak spot right now, and I hope we see a return to form. So where does this leave the rest of the update? City-states were the last thing I expected to get changed, but we have two new categories in diplomatic and expansionists. Their focuses are fairly obvious, but the larger overhaul to city-state bonuses wasn't covered in depth by Firaxis. If you've played the game recently, you might notice just how quickly eras can tick along. 1.2.3 added smoother transitions, which added a turn buffer zone so that players could finish up before progressing. However, a big contributor to this was how quickly you could rush through the tech tree via yield stacking. One of these big contributors was, you guessed it, certain city-state bonuses that would grant scaling bonuses or stack technology unlocks. The new update removed a lot of these features and instead replaced them with more appropriate modifiers. For example, the old science city-state bonus granted a stackable production boost to science buildings for each city-state of that type you were suzerain of. Now it's a generalized boost to building production with a smaller bonus. This is another deceptively big change that impacted my gameplay almost immediately. I noticed that my ages were progressing something like 10 to 15% slower, because myself and the AI were researching things at a far slower pace. I'll play devil's advocate and clarify that I don't know how much the AI was abusing city-state bonuses, but I was definitely running down the scientific and culture types as soon as humanly possible. It's kind of impressive how much the developers went back and reworked some of these attribute bonuses. I won't go over the full patch notes because they are extensive, but I will point out some big changes. The flat percentage buffs for the science, diplomatic, cultural, and economic trees have all been removed. The infamous Diplo tree perk that allowed for a stackable plus 3% boost for all alliances has been taken out back behind the shed. So this has easily been the largest balance pass Civ 7 has received thus far, and it's about time. A lot of the percentage buffs felt lazy, and there was very little interaction that you had to do with them. The new additions aren't amazing, but they are still big improvements over what we previously had available. There's also been a balance pass for resources and building costs. My understanding is that the devs believe players weren't putting enough thought into how they invested into towns, which is true. A lot of the time, you can get a resource like gold that reduces buyout costs, and then spam purchase buildings to your heart's content. Personally, I did tend to do this on cultures that had a better gold start like the Carthaginians and Axumites. However, the bigger issue that I am waiting for an answer to is the tall versus wide dichotomy. In Civ 5, 4 to 5 cities is basically mandatory and any wider requires an adjustment to your playstyle. Civ 6 said, settle as many cities as you want and Bob's your uncle. Civ 7 leans towards the latter, and while happiness is an interesting mechanic, it feels like an afterthought most of the time. It's always easy to go over the city cap. Players may bemoan it, but the happiness penalty for going over feels like such a slap on the wrist. I'm not saying it needs to be crazy punishing, because the game systems, as they are, feel like they want you to go wide. What I'm trying to say is we need more clarity on what the developers will do to make tall gameplay feel like an option. There's so many ways to implement this, but let me know in the comments if you would change anything. For me, I think the attribute system we just talked about is an easy way to reward smaller empires. Outside of certain cultures, it does not make sense to build fewer cities. I haven't had a huge amount of time to play with the two new types added to the roster, but I do think they have fun buildings to play around with, and I like that we have better representation. It felt like half of the city-states I'd encounter were militarist, and now I notice that my typical start has better diversity on average than before this update. But if I had to pick a personal favorite, I'd say that the diplomatic city-states have more interesting gameplay implications. Don't get me wrong, the Yakshal that expansionist city-states let you build is interesting, with bonuses to desert terrain. However, a lot of the other bonuses fall flat for me because they are just food buffs or a free settler. I would like to see more of a focus on other aspects of pop growth like specialists, but this is fine for now. Diplomatic city-states were much more fun for me. There are bonuses to the usual suspects like happiness and influence, yet there's a greater focus on opening avenues for diplomacy. The Send Delegation unlock allows players to see another nation's capital and get a small happiness buff. Other options like ideological revolt remind me of the partisans you could antagonize your neighbors with in Civ 6. This is quickly becoming my favorite city-state type, and there isn't a lot for me to criticize. I think if they approach other areas of the game with the same design philosophy of empowering player choice, we'll have a much stronger end product. But wait, there's more, folks. The very last part of this update includes a Napoleon rework, to both his revolutionary and emperor personas. I've always been partial to Emperor Napoleon, and the gameplay you're seeing now was one of my first playthroughs this patch. I haven't spent as much time with Revolutionary, but I left with similar impressions. This is a solid rework. Previously, Napoleon was an interesting character. Both of his personas revolved around being a scumbag, and Emperor Napoleon's continental system always caused trouble when I was playing against him. His playstyle encouraged nerfing other nations' trade routes and being rewarded with gold for it. His new ability makes sanctions cheaper, and you gain culture, gold, and unit strength for placing sanctions on other neighbors. I've had a lot of fun with this rework because you get far more mileage out of the culture and combat strength. You can also play good cop, bad cop with certain diplomatic cultures like Silla, which I did here. Normally, this pairing would seem very asymmetrical. I've instead found that it's worthwhile to pick a few guinea pigs you want to brutalize with sanctions, while allying up with a leader that can shield you from an early war. The other Napoleon is just stronger than before. He has better culture generation, and the free commander and units ensure that he has a bit of survivability. In any case, I will absolutely be avoiding him in all of my games because that ability looks like the mother of all snowballs. For the sake of ad revenue, I'll also be devoting the second half of this video to my impressions with the Right to Rule pack. Previously, I covered the first part of this DLC in my last video, which included Assyria, Daiviet, and Genghis Khan. I really enjoyed Assyria's design and was somewhat impressed with Daiviet. Going into the second half of this DLC, I wasn't expecting anything crazy out of Firaxis, but I'm pleasantly surprised with what I've played so far. Traditionally, Korea has always been a science-heavy civ. I know that Silla is more of a precursor to Korea, but the amount of restraint the developers showed by avoiding science impressed me. Being a diplomatic and economic culture, they focus on trade routes and building alliances. Just as Assyria felt like an evolution of Persia, Silla eclipses previous economic cultures like the Mississippians. Design-wise, I mean. Of course, nothing will ever beat the thrill of spamming burning arrows to your enemy's detriment. Shilla's trader unit still surpasses previous uniques like the Vaishya, in my view. The Sang Daidung provides gold equal to your relationship level with the recipient. Previous trader uniques did not feel very unique at all. They were often flat bonuses that did not interact with the other parts of a civ's abilities. The Hwarong is a less interesting addition to me, but that doesn't mean that I found it less powerful. Early on, I find the increased production cost to be very expensive to buy out, which leaves Silla quite exposed. Despite this, the unit scales quite well with its upgrades later into the Antiquity, and can tear through cities with shocking efficiency. But their actual civ ability is quite basic, being a +1 culture on resources. I've thought about why this is, and my conclusion is that it's to compensate for their more detailed buildings. These focus on mountains and rough terrain, so their placements can also be a bit finicky. I found myself restarting a few times to get a better setup, but your mileage may vary. The pagoda grants influence for mountain tiles and natural wonders, while lecture halls increase your resource limit when built on rough terrain. To me, this is a more distinct approach to unique buildings in terms of placements. You don't have to build them near mountains or on rough terrain since the base yields are decent, but when you have a great setup, they really shine through. Together, they form the Sachal unique quarter. This continues the trend of buffing cities for each unique resource they have slotted in, this time with gold. I appreciate the developers trying to make the buildings fit in with the rest of Shilla's kit. Other cultures, like the Kume, feel like they struggle with their identity because their kit is too simple. On the contrary, certain cultures feel too complex, and as a result, their abilities trip over each other, so to say. Silla isn't wildly complex, but it has enough detail for you to get an idea about what to focus on. If I had to make one complaint about their kit, it's that their unique wonder is so-so. The Emil Bell fits with the culture's abilities, but I've never felt that its ability is powerful enough to beeline. At least it's not the Birsa. Kahar is a similarly diplomatic-focused culture, but I found it to have far more interesting implications. Despite being expansionist, it is one of the few cultures that directly rewards a tall playstyle. Their second tradition, which I won't bother pronouncing, rewards you for having a few, well-developed cities. This scales for each settlement that you are under the limit for, so theoretically, you could have one immensely powerful city and a few towns to pump up your gold output. I haven't experimented too much with this culture, but I like that they encourage a more conservative playstyle. Kahar's unique infrastructure isn't as impressive. It sort of reminds me of France with bonuses for adjacent building types. That's not to say they are bad, but this isn't exactly a crazy unique ability that flips Civ 7 on its head. I feel similarly about their wonder, the Aram Garden. It reminds me a lot of Angkor Wat, a wonder that increases your specialist limit and provides a flat yield. Again, it's not bad, but it's something we've seen before. It is a pretty wonder though. The Civ has more unique units which I will not pronounce, but focuses on a more aggressive playstyle. Basically, the commander can rapidly burn down cities, with the unique cavalry getting increased healing and combat strength in their radius. They also get rewarded by their traditions for having higher population cities. Kahar's gameplay design harkens back to what I was talking about earlier with some civs being all over the place. My gist of this culture is that you can cozy up with a few allies that are far away, while bullying your neighbors for forward settling you. There is a serious concept versus execution issue for me here. I like being able to go tall while having the tools necessary to punish my neighbors, but I don't think this was the best approach. I prefer the developers to focus on giving the culture a clearer identity. Like, I don't think expansionist fits here. They are actively encouraged to focus on internal growth, and are rewarded for settling less cities. That feels like a contradictory label. Is Kahar a terrible culture? No. I think they can be a lot of fun if you know what you're doing, but do they have an amazing design? Obviously not, in my opinion. I have the same feelings about Lakshmibai, who is our second leader. Her design is okay, but it reuses a lot of pre-existing components from previous leaders. Machiavelli can already levy units, and Napoleon gets a percentage bonus for defeating enemy units. Also, Gandhi is guaranteed at this point. Do we really need another Indian leader when Mesoamerica and Africa are sorely lacking? I think Ashoka already covers enough as is with 2 separate personas. Perhaps Firaxis is catering to a larger Indian market, but I really don't see Lakshmibai being unique enough to merit a leader spot. For my final verdict, I thoroughly enjoyed the 1.2.5 update, and it is undoubtedly the biggest and best patch this game has received. Period. We've had some solid prior updates, but this is incredibly well rounded, and I think Firaxis choosing to hold off for a month and dedicate resources to this update was well worth it. However, the Right to Rule pack is overpriced. I can't sugarcoat it. $30 for 4 cultures, 2 leaders, and a handful of wonders is $10 short of an expansion. Now, if this was set at, say, $20, I could see a purchase being justified. I'm at a 3 out of 4 with the cultures, with Kahar being just okay for me. I believe this is an improvement over the previous DLC pack we received, but that's not enough to warrant the heavy price tag. But let me know what you think of the DLC we've gotten so far, and whether or not you've made the plunge. Also, I'd be happy to hear what your thoughts are on the 1.2.5 update, and if you've had the chance to play it yet. Thanks so much for watching, love you guys, and I hope to see you later. Peace.